Thank you, everyone. We're going to reconvene. Hi, John.
Hi.
We've got you there.
Wait, up on the big screen.
Well deserved as well. So we're going to hand over to Adam, who's now going to transition to host for session 3.
Great. Well, welcome to session 3. So this one, I think, is going to be where the rubber hits the road in the terms of what does this actually look like on the ground? How do we use Hurdle to inform practice? What practical and theological and theoretical difference does it make to the way that we do archaeology? And on the panel, we've got lots of practitioners and people who've been working in archaeology for a very long time, doing all sorts of wonderful things. So do you want to go and introduce yourself? We'll start with you, Ian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam. I'm Ian George. I'm Historic Places Manager for Lincolnshire County Council, which means I manage a team of people who manage the county's historic environment record and use that record to provide advice on development within the county of Lincolnshire, and also use that record to do things like run projects with external partners and partners across the county to try and interpret the county's heritage.
So you've already met me. Sue Evans. I'm here with a slightly different head on this session, in more of my research base, looking at the movement or displacement of known or unknown dead within churches and how we look after the monuments within the building.
Hello, I'm Jimmy Aitken. I'm the head of property and fabric at St Albans Cathedral and Abbey Church. I don't come from an archaeological background. My background is in built heritage conservation. So it's been really interesting bringing me up to speed on everything archaeological. My job, I manage a large site which has a lot of archaeology and it's a sensitive site. So this is going to be a really useful resource for me, I think. So yeah, it's been great to meet everyone and learn a lot.
Hello, my name's Fiona Keith-Lucas. I'm cathedral archaeologist at Worcester. I've only been in post about 18 months, but most of that time has been dedicated to a large project that we're just wrapping up at the moment. So we've got a £1 million re-landscaping of our main approach, which goes through the burial ground. So we've lifted around 130 individuals so far, and they will be reburied in our charnel crypt, which I believe is the only one which is in active use at the moment, but it's getting rather full and in a certain amount of disarray. So I'm also going to be reordering that over the next few months. So I'm specifying how we're going to reorder that.
Do you want to reintroduce
yourself? I guess just to explain my interloping and on this panel, I was wearing a different hat without as much experience as Jim, but looking into the evidence of craftspeople and how repairs Hurdle is reflecting, I suppose, the practices of builders and those that are manually conducting these things in the past.
And John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, my academic work was very much to do. Hello? Oh yeah, was very much to do with the bones and things. There's a time lag, isn't there? Right. I read a couple of books on the cult of saints. That was the doctoral thesis. And of course, as I've emphasised all the time, the cult of saints is absolutely physical. It's all to do with handling human bodies and human remains. But then with a completely different hat on, I was cathedral archaeologist for Winchester from the time the post was first set up in the 1990s until COVID struck. And I still act as archaeological consultant, that's to say buildings consultant as much as anything, but also below ground to various other places like St George's, Windsor and so on. So this anyway, we've got to get on, but lots of practical experience with trying to work out what on earth to do with bodies if we discover them, trying to manage bodies which have already been discovered and moved from one place to the other and so on. What on earth could Martin Biddle do with all the bones that he excavated when Old Minster in Winchester was excavated, and so on. Lots of questions. I'll shut up.
There's a lot of wisdom in the room, so it's going to be great to tap into that. The first question really Thinking about your kind of area of work and the stuff that is coming onto your desk day in, day out, how might Hurdle be useful to you in researching pre or post-investigative work on the building and the contents and what lies beneath? So how is the library going to help you?
I mean, I think Sue touched on some of this in the previous session, actually, but I think it's all about setting those flags, you know, the things that will warn people that there are issues they really ought to think about. And I think, you know, the church faces so many challenges over the next few years. I think John touched on it with the number of churches that are likely to go out of sacred use and conversion into private dwellings or whatever it might be. And the more information we can inform into that process, the better. You know, I run the county's historic environment record for Lincolnshire. And I think when we first started making those kinds of records 40 or 50 years ago, you know, everyone would have identified that the oldest building in the village was the church, you know, so that's an obvious thing that we make a record for. But you can bet your life for most of them, they went to the official listed entry, the list entry, you know, and cut and pasted from the list entry and popped that into the HER. And probably there has been much change about that record in the last 40, 50 years. So I would say as a resource in the county of Lincolnshire, churches are poorly documented in that way. Something like Hurdle, which is adding information into that system, is just so welcome as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Welsh Archaeological Trust a few years ago now did collate all the information together and did exactly what you just described.
Yeah.
Although of course that still is you know, debatable whether or not everything is in there. So from my point of view, the research I'm doing for my PhD work is that it is very difficult to try and find one place, because if you go into the in the archive, either local or national archive, you literally have, you know, I've got the faculty records there, I've got the warden's notes there, I've got the terriers there, and I'm trying to, the terriers are a logbook basically of everything within the church. They often come up with little snippets of information that become lost. So if you look at the terrier from, I don't know, 1710, and then look at the terrier in the church today, this is a logbook that's meant to be kept inside the church. They can be quite disparate between the two, but equally they can be really insightful. And so something like this means that when I'm going through my research, and anyone like me, it would be very easy for us to populate something like this to enable other people to learn. So I'm scrabbling around for tiny bits of information about where that human remain is, and was that fragment disarticulated, and actually was it found in relation to this particular monument that I'm researching, because that does hold a lot of really useful information, both from a researcher point of view, but also from a planner's point of view. Again, going back before to what intervention can we do? And then when I'm looking at planning permissions that come in through the Council for British Archaeology, and it's going out to other people to look at, I really need to understand a little bit more about if the church has been sold off, can they in actual fact put a door in there? Should they be able to put a door in there? I've seen really quite outrageous plans, and some of them are really innovative and would really work, and some of them just really don't work and destroy the heritage because they don't. It's not a known heritage. It's not known.
I'd say that that in the cathedral world, things are reasonably well managed in this regard. For example, in the 19th century, a large proportion of what we call the outer close on the north side of the cathedral was stripped of its trade by the zealous Dean Kitchen, but he did have the decency to make a plan of the burials before he did it. That's not true of many English churches which in the 60s were stripped of their monuments, which made knowing difficult. And unless you have particularly zealous clergy, they wouldn't have noted the place of burial within the churchyard. Then the church authorities decide they want to put up a church room, an excavation of skulls or foundations or whatever, probably a preliminary excavation in order to get the faculty. And lo and behold, there are bodies there. And then the relatives come in. Hello.
Well, I was thinking on the train up how I would use this as part of my day-to-day job, but I think just a kind of efficiency point of view and having one place to access information. Obviously, we have the cathedral architect and archaeologists who we work with closely, but just to answer a quick question, even just to tap into a database. I think the heat map thing is really. I know it's maybe bit simplistic at start, but the more it's fed into with data and findings, the better that will become. Just to answer, quick questions if we're considering doing some work. And also, I think having something to feed into in the future as well is really, maybe even more important. Having somewhere to, when we find what we find, to have somewhere to put that finding is really exciting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the next question. We'll come on to that in a minute. Is a bit more about that. Have you got anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, as John says, we, in a cathedral environment, are relatively blessed for records. Yeah. Within that, I've got a wide variety of records. Hidden within that are the burial accounts, and so this is a very useful way of filtering out the specific references to burials, and also that it marries that with the documentary evidence. So we have a librarian who's on top of that. It's really useful for me to just be able to dip into those specific sources that are related to burials.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in many ways, I'm still coming at this sort of from the outsider's perspective, but thinking perhaps about the uses along what Jimmy was just saying, that talking with masonry friends that work in churches, is that, well, I don't really have a resource to tell us where or what to do when we find human remains. And it'd be great if we had a resource that sort of warned us, maybe, or prepared us to come across them, but also might be something that we could feed into. And also perhaps give us then a connection to 2,000 years of, well, maybe 1,500 years of human practice around the same, the connection to Anglo-Saxon mason who has been coming across the same exact problems of, well, I have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of workforce. I still need to move this monument from here to here. How am I going to do that? And today, you might be able to say more, but assuming it's still happening. So
that's one of the strengths of the HRDL database. It goes from the 7th century right the way through to modern day. We're charting this huge sort of time depth, and within it you can see, I think we were chatting over coffee break about this idea of multiple ethics, that the Western view at the moment is, well, let's have one nice little document that has this clearly set out standards or ethics, this constitutes ethical practice. But actually, when you look through time, you can see that actually ethical practice changed massively depending on time and place. And I wonder whether that sort of depth of information is helpful in helping you to inform practices today.
When it comes to research elements of it, perhaps we can look at an example where I've got what's listed as a shrine fragment, but when you look deeper into the archives, you actually can come across that it isn't a shrine fragment at all. It's just a local carver that their work scattered across a particular area. And so I think that when we can relate that shrine fragment to a particular person, it can gain a lot of traction or agency, let's say. But does it lose agency because we've severed that connection to that saint? It still is relevance to the particular church I'm talking about across a particular area, geographical area. Does it lose significance? Does it not? And I think that if you associate that with, if you can, because there's literary evidence for it, if you can put that within this database, place it within the database, the spatial importance, or that it does actually then ring true, is really important. It may have lost one element of its significance or perceived significance, but it is still significant. So again, looking at from a research point of view, that's why a database like this, where we can hold that kind of information, is really important to us.
I think one of the exciting things that I've picked up on in the conversations I've had around this project is not only the fact that it's got this great time depth to today, but you as a research team have put positioning it in the future. You're seeing it has a relevance beyond today into the future. And that's, in my experience, from academic projects I've been involved with in the county of Lincolnshire, and one that's ongoing at the moment, is very rare, I think. And because I think the sustainability of this work means that you have to communicate with the outside world and practitioners like us, which gives it a real world relevance that very often is missing. So I think
it's
that's
like cross
particularly exciting.
multidisciplinary is absolutely key. You look at just the people in this room, all those people that can inform, you know, whether I've got my research head on, my church head on, or a plan head on, this is all still relevant because it does cross-reference. And again, that particular shrine fragment is not associated necessarily with a human remains, but there still is associations there that are very important. Like working, it chimes very well, working across the whole area.
Yeah.
One of the things about this project is the searchability aspect, which was underlined right at the beginning, and that sort of relates to what one might be doing. I might be doing my local parish church just outside the window there when they'd have building projects. I write an archaeological report along the same lines as I would for a cathedral, but I have to go back and I have to look at records. Now, so many of the records of previous work could well be lurking either in record offices, or dare I say it, on something like the Oasis database, which is a wonderful resource, but it's not searchable in the sort of way.
Yeah.
Right. No. So all I'm saying is, yes, there is scope. I think people need to be encouraged to write their archaeological reports, minor or major. They need to be deposited. And right at the end, no doubt, there will be summing up and methodology of how you can extract the information to stop it becoming grey literature. All this stuff which I got on my computer and which my nephews will press the destruct button. Well, they won't because it's going into various record offices, but you know what I mean.
It's leading us nicely into the next question, which is about a fully integrated register. So at the moment, there isn't one, obviously, or database of church archaeology. We had a great chat about the ADS earlier, and that was a really useful resource. I've got about 600 reports from the ADS, and then looked at Arquilio, and then emailing cathedral archaeologists and various other people to say, have you got this report? So the information is out there in different places, but we don't yet have a central sort of database. How do you think Hurdle might assist in the absence of this?
Go on. No, well, I was just going to say that I certainly do think it will. I think we have to bear in mind that one of the things that I think holds church archaeology back is the lack of resources. And as I've been sitting here this morning, I've just been thinking about, I would say, 95% of the archaeological work done by the average archaeological contractor is going to be in the secular world. It's not going to involve a church. And so occasionally they would have to dip their toe into the world of church archaeology. And then they will discover that there isn't any money because the PCC is very poor. And, so they're going to have to do it on a shoestring. The project will be done on a shoestring. So that means corners might be cut a little bit, and the overall potential of the archaeological resource that they're investigating doesn't get fully investigated. So, I've got projects in Lincolnshire funded by developers where we're getting DNA research done on human remains, and we're having all sorts of mineral analysis done to find out where these individuals were born and brought up. That very rarely happens on any work that might happen within a church because of the resources. So, that's just a caveat, really, I suppose, when it comes to sort of long-term record keeping.
I think that having the right people involved at the right level is key. And certainly when it comes to looking at the faculty applications that come through, when you see that, again, we've got the 80-year-old nester is putting the application together and doesn't understand the process. So in actual fact, we do have churches where they've had a reordering which looks fabulous, but in 5 years' time they suddenly realise that they didn't address the issues that came up in the quinquennial review, which means that the church can no longer be used because nobody's got any money to. And certainly when it comes to grants, where the grants are coming from. But what is interesting, which I found in the last 12 months alone, is that the grant funders, a heritage fund is an absolute perfect example, is they are insisting now that there's funds for research. And so the team has benefited from that new element, that they are now realising that having the wardens overseeing all of the work isn't the way forward, and that they insist on having the correct type of research involved within the project. And so that does mean that this is opportune moments to launch something like this, because you're feeding straight into what people like Heritage Fund, and they're the ones with the big money. So it is an opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, one
But
doesn't
John-
want to- oh, sorry. Well, just say
No.
you don't want to bring in more bureaucracy, and yet, if I were working in with the cathedral or whatever, I'd be drawing up an archaeological report, and amongst the conditions for the work to be undertaken would be one to deposit the archive in a particular repository. Now, maybe as HDRL grows and becomes better known, the diocesan registrars should be saying it's a condition of these works that the archive is deposited with, insofar it relates to human remains, should be deposited with HDRL. It's not much to ask, but it means that the material doesn't just disappear into the ether.
Archaeological, scale. So in other words, if a local unit goes in and excavates a local field, you get that, but you don't get it in. It's regulated completely different in churches. And I've seen many recommendations from archaeologists and the conservation officer who just, though we've got the WSI, that's done. I've ticked that box. We were talking before, weren't we, about that. We've ticked that box now, and so that's fine. I've done that bit. And there's no concept. A lot of the conservation officers I'm coming across have no archaeological experience or at all, and they just see it as a tick box. And although cathedrals may have that in place because it's regulated differently, I suppose, if you've got cathedral archaeologists on the ground, that's not what's happening with local parish churches.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. So let's hear a bit more from the cathedral's point of view then. So your record keeping is much more enhanced. It's much more well established.
It's thorough, but I would say it's not as accessible as it should be. So I can readily access all the reports over the last 40 years. But if anybody else wants to, that's slightly more problematic.
That's exactly what I'm finding. Yeah. To get to that person, and grant the one as well. If you want some money off anybody, it's like you can email a generic email address and get nothing for 18 months. You get given a name and you're in.
I think, our system is good and it works well, I think, but I'm fairly certain it's very different to every other cathedral's system. There will be similarities, but also, and then I think I was talking to someone earlier about how, personnel changes. So you have a system that maybe someone's been there for 20 years, has been using it's really good, but someone else will come in and completely change it. It may still be just as good, but it's, different formats, different filing systems. So you instantly get that sort of jar, and trying to go between two systems is hard sometimes. So having a universal system is always, to be encouraged and celebrated.
Yeah.
And in the time being then, so Hurdle would have sort of additional information that would be useful to your interpretation of in your daily work, or not?
Well, like I said earlier, bringing up the documentary into the archaeological reports, I think, is where I would see particular value. Yeah.
This reminds me, I remember when the sort of big push for the sort of Dendro database, national database, came out, and there was this, at first it was really clunky and a bit clumsy, but it's just a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, sort of decades in, it's really getting more and more accurate, and it's really useful. I think one of the questions about limitations, it seems a bit harsh to talk about limitations of something that's such a new technology. So I think keep going and keep feeding into it, and it'll just refine itself.
Yeah, that's where the legacy lies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, John, we've got a question on saints and tombs that you might be interested in.
Oh yes.
Some tombs and shrines are deliberately left untouched because of their significance. And this may mean that other burials and monuments have to be moved instead of for the greater good. So how might records in Hurdle for these tombs be useful for managing the known and the untouchable dead? Glenn.
Right.
Well,
Right. Here's a tricky one. Well, actually, we've got St Albans represented, so I'm rather embarrassed to talk about St Albans, but my experience there was with helping Martin Biddle excavate the underneath the tomb of St Alban when that was removed, and lo and behold, underneath the shrine of St Alban, underneath the shrine was a vault which was vaguely known about but not particularly well recorded, to a local family called Gape, 18th century, I think, and so we made our way down to this burial vault for the first time. Now, that had been obliterated, if you like. The family 18th century grave had been covered over when the shrine of St Albans was re-erected in the late 19th century. So there's an example, if you like, where there was loss of memory and obliteration of a tomb. So I'm not sure if that really answers the question at all. The other point about St Albans, of course, is the shrine of St Amphibolus. I was on a seminar which was arguing for the conservation of the shrine, which has now been done. But I argued very loudly and indeed that it should be reinstated in the Lady Chapel, where the 14th century was located. 14th century shrine was located, and I was told very firmly by the dean, who got really slightly quite assertive, that no, that wouldn't work because the Lady Chapel was used for weddings, and the wedding party would have to split going past the shrine. So it stayed where it was in the North Aisle. Anyway, that's by the by. I don't think I've answered the question at all, but thank you for listening.
Well, I mean, if I interject, I think that you did do a really eloquent job doing so, and that I think Hurdle is throwing up a lot of evidence, at least from the medieval period, of how the special or the known dead are dealt with. It. Amphibolus is a known person. He has pilgrims, and St. Alban have pilgrims, and so we're going to pay attention to them. But if the money runs out from your family and they can no longer sort of upkeep your plot, or people forget about you. I mean, I think what Hurdle is trying to show is that they're the ones that end up in the bin bags. They're the ones that are in the Aldi bags, sort of thing. And so it's, I guess, hopefully trying to provide us some more context of how to deal, one, historically with the great swaths of unknown dead, but then also appreciate that, not to sort of go onto the turf of some of the later sessions in storytelling and belief and practice, but this hierarchy, I suppose, that one bit of bone is more important than another bit of bone, just because the people living at the time think that bit of bone is something, and that has then direct implication on, okay, Jim, your team then has to treat that particular skull much differently than they would the ones that you're coming across in the garden.
Yeah, so just thinking about our recent project, not so much the elite burials, but just in reference to named versus unknown. So we've excavated a lot of graves, unknown graves, but there was only one known, because there was the slab that we were working around. So we lifted the slab and it was unstable, and there was a shaft burial that we recovered. But that particular grave received different treatment from everyone else because he's named.
Different parts of the body can receive different treatment too. And in the excavation of Old Minster, which Martin Biddle did, he discovered a huge charnel pit outside the west end of Winchester Cathedral, which were the remains of the burials that had been disturbed when the cathedral nave was extended. But he didn't find complete skeletons. Well, they were certainly not articulated. But the point was that the what had been retained were the skulls and the femora, and that was it. A skull and crossbones, if you like, for each person. And when I was excavating within the cathedral for a lift shaft a few years ago, what I discovered was a lot of disarticulated human remains, but there were no femurs and there were no skulls. So there had been differential treatment.
It does pose lots of questions when we're looking at in planning context. Certainly the project I'm working with at the moment, where we think we know, as it were, from literary sources, that there are bardic burials, in other words, medieval poets buried within our church. So in other words, that's a known entity, and we are about to go in the floor where we think that they would be. But in the past, when that part of the flooring has been lifted, I've got eyewitnesses records where they tell me they were everywhere, that they were scattered, articulated and disarticulated, and I'm intrigued about the way that they are treated, whether they're articulated or disarticulated, and that how do we talk about those remains, and if we find our bards, how are we going to find them, and do we treat them differently? And that does intrigue me, the way that when we're moving forward into the project, when I can perceive that it will be quite different. And certainly if we find a crypt or a crypt covering, will the DAC allow me to delve further into that, or are we just able, because it's part of the planning process and it's not part of the application, obviously, we don't touch them, so we note them. We know that could be, but we've got no evidence for them to be. So that's why this in many ways helps me, because it helps to inform the community that I'm working with, as well as inform research elements as well. I think it's twofold there, isn't it?
I just wanted to step in with an interesting example from last year. So we had a series of outreach sessions that were provided by the unit that are doing the excavation. And obviously the excavation is in a burial ground, and it was my desire to have human remains as part of that, because I thought it was relevant to the project and that people would be interested. Now, that wasn't to have them as handling objects, but I thought it would be appropriate and had support of the clergy. But the people delivering the sessions weren't happy to do that. And in the end, basically said, well, maybe in the future, if we can flesh out some ethical policy, we might consider it. But they weren't prepared to. And I thought it was interesting, you know, we were talking about how ethics change over time, but also personal ethics may differ. And one of the points that they made was that if the remains were known and we were able to tell a story, perhaps that would be more relevant. And I mean, my take on it would be completely the reverse of that. I would be uncomfortable having known remains on a table. Yeah. And I just thought that raised some very interesting differences.
It's part of the narrative, I think. Like, I'm told that's why I mentioned the Bardic one, that my community are more interested in that. It's not they don't care about the disarticulated remain, they other them. But the concept of a bard, because that's part of their Welsh, their identity. Yeah. And then now I've got, you know, local GPs coming to me saying, do you know when you go in the ground, you need volunteers? So I've got about 5 GPs waiting on the list that they want to come and we'll just have the community in to look at them. And then I've had schools in and I'm saying to them tentatively, what's your thought on this? And they're saying the same thing, that those disarticulated unknown dead are interesting, but in actual fact, if there's a story, then we'll definitely come and we'll be involved in that. So
I want to pick up on that word community, which you've both really well flagged up, and we're probably going to have to cancel lunch to talk about this. But it's something that happens, isn't it? That the known dead are treated differently, and you know, there's a famous Lincolnshire explorer who there's a hoo-ha over that recently, which Ian might want to talk about. But a sense of who is the community and how does HRDL help to inform a picture of who the community is. So one of the things that struck me about grave goods is that Protestant cathedrals are the storehouse of material culture in Britain, and it's all under the floors. And it's the question of, well, okay, so we can excavate a chalice and a paten and a body, a priest, a Catholic priest, but actually who is the community who has a voice over those objects and the intangible links between the grave goods and the people, and the links between the current worshipping community and the local parishioners who may not go to church, but you know, their grandparents are buried in the churchyard. Does HRDL give us insights, and does it help us with the angly sort of issues or not? Or does it muddy the waters even more?
Well, for me, you're getting into that territory as to whether a church is a heritage attraction or whether it's a living place of worship. And I suppose the Matthew Flinders example that you're referring to is quite interesting in that context, because Matthew Flinders, when he died, was buried in Euston in North London. And when they started the work for the possible new HS2 terminus in adjacent to Euston Station, they excavated the burial ground. I can't remember the name of the burial ground, the cemetery, but anyway.
St James. St James is
it? Yeah, St James. Yeah, they came across Flinders' burial. They were easily able to identify him because the name plaque from the coffin was still in place. So he has been treated very specially. And of course, the local community in Donington in Lincolnshire, where he was born and educated and lived until he went exploring, were very excited by this. They already had some interpretation in the church about his life and his adventures and his successes in Australia in particular, and have a lot of community connections with Australia. Last summer, his remains were reinterred in the church, and it is having this gradual effect on that church of turning it more and more into a heritage attraction and less a living place of worship as they take over more and more of the church space with all this story of Flinders. So, yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? Yeah. Don't know. I have an answer, but
I think my point with the church is both. Now. It's both heritage and a place of worship.
In fairness, the church community, they are trying to find that balance. They are aware of that.
And again, that's where a lot of the funding is. To do any of the work. Because churches don't have the money to do the work. So that's why it's handed out.
Yeah.
I think in terms of hurdle, just having dipped into it recently, I think it's evident that throughout time there are concerns about respect, but there's also a fascination and a balance of the two.
Yes, I was really wary of saying when we lifted the floor we find human remains. It was actually, I think it's Ruth that we had a conversation we had about saying yes, actually people are okay with coming in and viewing, and so I've tentatively started to work with community and starting to broach that subject, and it amazes me how macabre everybody is. Yes, and the children are like, what? There's dead people. So they, I think that doesn't, and that for the teachers to be able to walk away, which is what we've started to do, walk away from the building, having had this tour and this guide and some lessons there, that they walk away and they have an additional resource that's available to them outside of the heritage space in their classroom. That's absolutely key for them as well. So to have that additional resource, so whether it's a university or whether it's a local heritage archaeological group or whether it's a school, so that resource to have that available is also quite key.
And Dawn and I were having a fascinating chat before this about getting into the medieval mindset, and through literature it gives you really good understanding, not complete understanding, of course, because archaeology is fact. That's just where we get the real. When you put the two together, when you put the two together, you start to see a more complete picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
It gives interesting insight into communities who feel some sort of identity connection with objects and with those people. And
identity is key, isn't it?
And getting ourselves out of the sort of Western traditional mindset at the moment of who the community is and what an object is, what is sacred, what does sacred mean, what does consecration mean, how does that look like today when we excavate sacred objects and sacred individuals from sacred places.
It's also interesting what impact on the archaeologist the known burial has, because I think most archaeologists at some time in their life would have excavated a skeleton, some human remains, and that individual will be completely anonymous. And so we, as excavators, start making assumptions about their life, and we sort of see traces on their bones, and we think, hard life and all that, and start making assumptions. Whereas if we have a known individual, we can make that leap that little bit further forward and start actually peopling the past with these. It's quite an interesting one, I think.
It just creates a narrative.
It does.
The community to hook onto, to anchor onto. That it may not actually be the bard that we found, but you think it is, and I'll go with that.
I guess maybe if I go on that though, it almost seems though that the gate. Wondering again, the gatekeepers is probably not the best word, but perhaps the people most apt to control whether we know the individual are the people who are oddly then unknown themselves. They're the crafts, like the stonemasons. I just think of a few years ago, I was volunteering on a castle in France, and we were putting in some spiral staircases and carving stones for them. All of the stones were former headstones, and so that record's completely obliterated now, and the headstones themselves have been removed from wherever it was. But this is good stone; it's readily available, and somebody's made the decision that memory is no longer needed. So as soon as the headstone's up and gone, those remains have now all of a sudden become anonymized and moved into a different space. But then this is, maybe Tom could say more with the charnel effect. Do they then become also more important as the unknown communal dead that are part of a larger story that is not attached to, oh, this guy was a bit of an asshole, so sort of thing, knock his headstone down, sort of thing. So yeah, I just think, yeah, the inflection point of you have then all these different layers, I suppose, that Hurdle can bring out to help maybe to guide people who are still making those decisions today.
I think once there's always that big energy, if there's a project or a dig or a building being put up, so a dig happening. I think once the dust has settled and the building's there and everyone's carried on with something else in their lives, you still need that place to keep all this knowledge and this information. Otherwise, that just drifts off as well. And
Sure.
That chimes very well with the idea before we were talking about with iconoclasm and the Buka effect. And that's what I find a lot, is that the concept is that it's iconoclasm. In actual fact, it isn't. It's just, it's a really good piece of stone. And so that's why that's why the head's gone. Not because somebody didn't like the person or there was something, it's some symbol on the head. It is actually just that it's useful. So everything gets put through with iconoclasm. And that's not actually what's happening at all in lots of instances,
So we're nearly at time. One of the things we don't have time to talk about, but I think is worth flagging up, is that you talked about obviously the differential treatment of the named and the unnamed, but then you started talking about the articulated and the disarticulated. And actually we can see in contemporary archaeological practice, but also in the past, how the two are treated quite differently as well. I think that comes out through both the textual records and the archaeology. It's the level of significance or worth that's put on a complete skeleton as opposed to just a fragment of a little bone which gets barely a sentence in the grey-lit report.
Like the cremated remains, the same thing. The cremated remains is completely different. They just put them on the ground. It's just completely different.
Well, you can all see the food coming in, so
That's the sign, isn't it? It's the universal sign.
Lucky you.
Oh yeah,
That's right.
sandwich.
Yes. Well, the church, the burial service puts it in perspective, really, doesn't it? Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. We can't keep all the bodies. I well remember my interest as an archaeologist when they were digging my mother's grave to see that there was another disarticulated body which was being disturbed on that spot. So the gravedigger removed the body, popped it in beside the potential, went back into the backfill. It has always ever been thus. But luckily, we don't have to actually. We're at session 4, which is discussing these much more thorny issues. Yeah, thank you very much for letting me join the session.
Thank you, everyone on the panel, for a brilliant conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Right, look forward to the afternoon. Turn off.
Thanks, everyone. So we are now just going to break for lunch. Please do help yourself. There's been a refresh there on the drinks too. If you do need any more water, we'll get a refreshing this afternoon. But in the meantime, feel free to pop next door to the kitchen, and Jeanette will very kindly fill up glasses for you. Just a reminder, if you do go back downstairs, a bit of breath of fresh air. Close the door to let yourselves out. Don't just keep pulling on, be like, I'm locked in the building forever talking about church burial. And then just let the receptionist know she'll push you straight back. So we'll reconvene at 2 p.m. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.